liked how they talked about John a lot, right? That they told personal stories and they gave anecdotes from some of the work that he did. Yeah, absolutely. That's been really gratifying. And there is one of the ideas we've talked about is pulling some of those stories out and making just sort of like a film about him using some of those stories that people have told rather than, all the 45-minute talks compiled together, but doing sort of a short film on that. Neat. Other observations? Have they been what you expected?
I have a comment.
Yes, please, Chris.
No, they have not been what I expected. I kind of expected the usual kind of conference-esque environment, but it is very personal. I mean, in relative terms, because of the disconnection between our bodies, but it's nice to hear the personable aspect of how they view things, and it is nice to be able to talk to them and ask them questions.
Did you guys hear any of that? Yeah. So Chris is saying it's nice to hear the personal stories, and they haven't been. He expected sort of a little bit more polished conference paper, like sort of formal statements, and these have been much more casual to kind of summarize there. Neat. Anyone else? Yeah, so Nick is saying that they have been much more conversationable, much more sort of human. And it is like you're sitting around, they would probably say having a drink, but right, conversing with these academics and intellectuals that have contributed so much. I know I've been a groupie for Patty Limerick, right, for 20 years. And so it's neat to have her just sort of sitting there on my computer and talking, right, and seeing what is coming out of that. I'll be curious to see how much they change, right? We have a really long list of people, and these first two speakers probably share the most in that they are academics and they teach at universities and they have known John through pretty much the same kinds of circles. So we'll check in about this again. Any other comments about the speakers? I was really impressed with your questions on Wednesday, so thank you for using the chat to do that and for pulling those in there. You'll find that many of the questions take up 10 minutes, right? So sometimes it's hard to get all of the questions in there, but we will try and make time as we go through the semester for them all to fit in. Okay, so the agenda for today is to talk a good bit about conservation. And I'd like to hear from you guys what conservation is. So tell me, I read several of your journals, so I have some notes on things that you've said, but what is conservation? What do we mean by that term? And I'll go ahead and throw it up on the slide. You can look back in your journals if that's helpful. If you're on Zoom, you're welcome to.
I can go ahead and give
yeah.
I view conservation as like the preservation of not just the environment, but the history and the community and everything that has to do with it, since it's all somewhat interconnected.
Yeah, so maybe interconnectedness of a particular place.
Right.
Would that be a way of doing it? Yeah. Neat. What else is conservation? Leif. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Neat. So the focus of it can be quite distinct, right? But the protection, you sort of echoed protection and preservation, right? Slightly different, but both Leif and Eli pointing out those terms are critical. What are some other pieces of conservation? Allie. Acknowledging what, sorry? Yep. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, responsibility is an important verb there, right? If I could spell it. What else? I still spelled it wrong. Okay, those of you with your cameras off, if I call on you, I hope that you can give me an answer. Riley, what's something you would add here?
Example of conservation always has to do with the environment. I see a lot of stuff about history and society, but I think the environment's probably the most important just going forward.
Yeah, and what do you mean by the environment? Excellent.
Mainly just the health of the ecosystems and whatnot. There's lots of problems just other than global warming that contribute to that stuff, kind of like ocean acidification, all that type of stuff.
Super, excellent. What about Jessica? Do you have anything to add here that we haven't talked about yet? Thank you, Riley, for those comments. So there's a couple things that I would add here.
I could, I'll make a comment.
Please.
I would say that it's, well, I'll just read if I can get this out of the way. A sorted effort by public and private entities to preserve natural processes. So kind of like hydrological processes and chemical processes of plants to produce oxygen, those kinds of things. But there needs to be a partnership between our public entities and the private sector, not just like companies, but individuals.
Neat. Grace, do you want to add something there?
Hi, everyone. Emily, thank you for letting me sit in on the series. It's really great. One of the things that has really struck me about everyone talking here is that all of these definitions or all of these thoughts are really human-centered and they're really anthropocentric. And when we think about the idea of conservation, thinking about what are we conserving and for whom, or not for whom, but or for what species. And it's just really kind of an interesting twist when we think about conservation is we're a species that defines the term, but who are we doing it for? So.
Excellent, thank you. So this is Grace Wang, who's the Director of Environmental Studies at Western Washington University, who's sitting in with us today. And her comment summarized, for those of you in the classroom that probably couldn't hear her, that the student comments really put humans at the center of conservation, and it might be worth thinking about whether other species can conserve as well, right? Or if it's purely an anthropocentric term. And in fact, in each of these comments, we could probably pick apart and ask what is meant by the pieces, right? So when you preserve something, what does that mean? Does that mean putting it in a jar and setting it on the shelf like you would a jar of jam, right? And then it doesn't change for the rest of the future, right? Or does it mean, sort of like Chris and Riley said, it's a system, right, that needs to be preserved, or a set of natural processes, which is another important set of terms, although what's natural, right? Is a place where beavers have been completely extirpated and then they're returned. Is that natural? Is that still a natural process? Because it involved those animals. But what if humans were involved in that reintroduction? And are humans themselves natural, right? So are the things that we do part of nature too? So we're not going to get into the answers to all of those, but I do want you to think about sort of who has been historically involved in conservation, because that's the topic for today, and what it has meant mostly in the framework of the United States. And then I'll spend a good bit of the next half hour or so kind of expanding the way conservation has been viewed in the US and putting that in a slightly different context. But I would like you to spend a couple minutes. I'm going to go ahead and try and put you Zoom folks in a couple breakout rooms and have you do it. And I'd like you to consider the questions on the slide, right? Who participated in conservation? Who was it for? And why? What were they trying to do? I think in the, Mackenzie, I don't think I can do the breakout rooms. Do you see?
Let me make you the host. Hold on.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. It may have stopped the recording, but I think you've got it. So.
Okay, perfect. There we go. Let's just do 2 rooms. So you should accept the invitation to join a room, please, and then I will dissolve you in about 5 minutes. And once again, here is the slide is linked through Zoom, so you can pull those up on your computer if you want, or where'd you go? You can look at them. I guess I can't screen share. And do that. Okay, so this is a pretty good group, even though we're yelling at each other from this distance. What counts as conservation? I like the breadth of people's definitions that were clearly sort of expanded from a traditional interpretation. But classically, if you take a history class, who and what are we talking about when we're talking about conservation? What comes to mind? Allie? Policies, absolutely. Laws, regulations, policies. You know, conservation has kind of an apparatus that's enforced, right? Nice. What else? Lee? Parks, yes. Conservation is often a synonym for parks, right? And I fall into that a lot because what I study is parks, and so sometimes I use them interchangeably. But parks aren't the only form of conservation. And surely if they're in breakout rooms, they're not listening to me, right? There are all these really weird, like, let's just, oh well, nobody's complaining. So I think they're okay. But there's a whole swath of things beyond parks, right? Especially national parks are sort of the crown jewel of conservation, but there's state parks and there's local parks and there's reserves and there's all kinds of other types of territories. What else comes to mind? When do we think of conservation happening? Yeah, so focus around particular animals, right? Species beyond animals, sometimes it's plants, but very rarely, right? And the protection of those. Excellent. What else? What are some other pieces that come to mind? Yeah, it very much is a modern thing, even though, as Patty Limerick said last week, right, there are antecedents, especially in royal hunting reserves. There are really interesting antecedents in Latin America. So Cuauhtemoc, one of the last emperors of the Aztecs, had zoos in Mexico City. And there is still a zoo today. So it's probably the oldest form of conservation in the Americas that was formalized in a particular way, right? There's debate whether holding animals in cages to see them is conservation, right? But there is some interesting intentionality there that echoes with these sentiments. So why? And Daniel brings up the really important point. It's a modern thing. What is it about the modern world that caused people to stand back and say, whoa, maybe we should think about our consumption. Whoa, maybe we should put some places under protection. Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. So the exponential growth of humans on the planet, right? And it's not an even pattern how that happens, right? And there's some pretty big pandemics and wars and other events that disrupt that. But overall, in the time period Daniel described, the late 19th century to the present, human occupation of the planet has exploded, right? In any way you measure it. Leif, what else? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Precisely. And so it's not just the growth in population, but it's the urbanization, in particular of the US, right? So it's where people are concentrated. And then it's the sort of use, right? And what's so interesting is how much, and this really still holds true, right? In a lot of ways, Easterners wanted to protect the West, right? And as you said, Teddy Roosevelt is such a classic example of that sentiment coming up. Excellent. Okay, so let me see if I can get the Zoom folks back and hear a few things from them. Oh my goodness, what have I done? Did I? No. What am I trying to do? Oh boy. Welcome back. Okay, so the folks in the classroom talked about conservation historically as something in the US that happened in the modern era. And normally I would have you summarize your own thoughts, but they can't hear you when you do it. So I'm just gonna sort of shortcut it here. Something that happened in the modern period, right? Late 19th century through the 20th century, really characteristic of the West. So Leif told us a little bit about North Dakota. There were some paradigmatic figures like Teddy Roosevelt, right, that were sensitive to this increase in population and to the continued or expanded use of resources, especially in cities, right, what we might otherwise call industrialization. Who else can add to that from Zoom? And I will amplify it out here. What are some other things that historically we associate with conservation? Or whatever it was you talked about in your breakout room.
I'll share.
Thanks, Eli.
Christopher. So we talked about how it is mostly centered around.
Sorry,
we talked about how it is mostly centered around human use. I just brought up another wacky question, which is, do animals conserve? And yes, we found out that squirrels, they store their nuts for the winter. And then there's people in that have African mines that contain diamonds, and they can serve to maybe raise the prices of diamonds worldwide. We talked about where you mostly occurs, as we know, in the Western United States. And then why, yeah, that's kind of repetitive. It's for the our consumption.
Great. So perhaps with the exception of squirrels, conserving their nuts, right, sort of going forward, really a human-centered activity historically in the U.S., largely in the U.S. West. Anything else that folks would like to add? Okay, so another piece in here is this question of what public policy is. And this came out in the readings, in particular from the Law Journal that I had you read, right? Jedediah Purdy's article on the long environmental justice movement. And he talks a lot about the legal apparatus that has undergirded the US's approach to environmentalism, right? Environmentalism and conservation, not, of course, the same thing, but deeply intertwined. And for him, the law is an important strand of that long movement, but it's not complete. And so I thought it might be useful to think of the term public policy, right? This is designed as a public policy class. It's part of important strand of public policy research that Boise State contributes to. We have a master's in public policy that some of you might be interested in pursuing, also a PhD, which Mackenzie is of course a part of. But public policy is important to be seen as a newer idea, right? One that really came up as a framework in the late 1960s and early 1960s. Before that, people talked about law, right? Or judicial systems and legislative systems and sort of broader. But public policy is what we talk about now. A more global way of thinking about this, and there's some really interesting theorists that talk about governmentality, right? And governmentality is the way people respect governance that comes down upon them and often observe it, right? So conservation is an important vehicle for this. There's some really neat research that's been done on South Asia in particular by a scholar named Arun Agrawal. And he says that people adopt conservation policies and see them as their own, even if they're imposed on them in an authoritarian perspective, right? And so he looked at people in Bengal that became foresters because that's what the state told them to do. So they were following orders, they were obeying the law, and they were participating in what in the US we might call public policy, but more broadly, this framework of governmentality. But another piece here is the sort of critique against formal policy that's coming out in a lot of the readings for today, which is a critique of environmental justice. And so this is where the reading by Jed Purdy and the Caroline Finney chapters work together in allowing us to expand what we think of in terms of public policy. So in other words, public policy includes a whole suite of enforceable, regulatable, state-based policies, right, that include the law, but are also broader than it. So this might be collecting and enforcing taxes, right? So the IRS is perhaps the most powerful arbiter of public policy, right? Because that's how we get revenue to run all the other policies. Regulations are often where the laws meet the road. The interpretation of those regulations and those statutes is often left up to people who work in agencies, right? And every law has to be interpreted and applied, whether it's one, like Alyssa said, that protects species, right? And the varied interpretations of the Endangered Species Act and their application are that act of public policy. And law is central to that, but not all that's there. As always, you have access to these slides. They're linked through the syllabus. So if that's a useful framework for you, there are other things, and I'm sure Mackenzie could put a bunch more in this bubble as well. But it's a way of thinking about public policy as something more expansive than what it says in the 1970 Endangered Species Act, right? It is interpretive, and because it's interpreted and applied, it is subject to cultural change, right? So some of my colleagues and I asked this question a couple years ago. We asked, why is it that states all around the world, right? In 2006, Afghanistan declared its first national park. Why would a country coming out of a violent conflict, still occupied by the US military and looking for a formal government system, create a national park? Right? What would they have been doing? Well, a lot of things, but one of them is signaling to the world that they're modern, right? That they've come of age and that they have a government or a public policy apparatus capable of protecting nature. And so my colleagues, one of whom was German, one from the UK and the other from the country of Colombia, and I wrote a book about the nature state. And we asked this question: why is it that countries would protect nature? It makes a lot of sense, and perhaps every government that's ever existed has claimed resources for the use of that state, right? So it makes a lot of sense for a country to say, these forests are ours, this water is ours, these deer, these salmon, whatever they are, these belong to us, and we're going to use them to feed our people, to build things, whatever, right? It would be hard to imagine a state that didn't do that, right? So that's obvious. But why would a state say, these are ours, these resources belong to us, and we're not going to touch them? We're going to leave them there for the enjoyment of people, for the subsequent evolution of natural processes, as a check on our urban society, or for whatever list of reasons. Why do that? And it's particularly common in the 20th century, right? Nearly every state has a national park. Almost every country in the world. I forget the total, it's in the book somewhere, but, and Patty Limerick amplified this when she asked the question, the first of the 8 that she pointed out, which is conservation compatible with democracy, right? If democracy is giving people the ability to choose how they're governed, and conservation is declaring something off protected, right, off limits, how can we make those two things compatible, especially if a majority of the population prefers to use those resources rather than to conserve them, right? So one of the places where you can explore this question, if it's interesting to you, is in the World Database of Protected Areas. So there's a link to it there. It's called protectedplanet.net. And it is basically government compilations of all the parks in the world. And so you can look at the layers of the maps, you can look up particular places, you can look it up by country, and you can see what percentage of each country is protected. But it is overwhelming how many places have done this in such a short amount of time, right? So if conservation is such an important and such a large global force, it's worth asking kind of why that is. So, one of the places that we look to understand why nature states emerged where they did is the kind of traditional roots of conservation. And this has been told largely as a story of American exceptionalism, right? Or a story about how the United States did something really awesome, and it did it in a way that set the precedent for the rest of the world. And this is an important narrative to know, if only to challenge it and to see where the holes are in it, right? So this is a narrative that is largely populated by these men, right? One of whom has already come up. Tell me what you know about John Muir or Teddy Roosevelt. What are the things you think of when you think of these men and this sort of iconic picture of them? Yosemite, yep, absolutely. So they're standing at Yosemite together, right, contemporaneously. So they clearly knew each other, were part of the same movement. What else? Yeah, very much pointed or painted as American heroes, right? This is such an emblematic image of American exceptionalism, masculinity, heroes, sort of westward. I mean, it's everything, right? It's the hats, it's the landscape in the back, it's the way they're standing, it's the beard and the handkerchief, right? All of those pieces put together this picture of conservation in a particular light. Conservation is powerful, conservation is white, right? And conservation is something that happens out in the West. This is very much true. So in two of the pieces that you read, two of the blog posts, there was a critical analysis of both John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt. And we could spend weeks, right, sort of debating the lives of both of these men. The number of biographies on Roosevelt would, fill this desk, if not half of this room. Muir has also had a lot written on him. And I'm not a huge proponent of the idea that we need to hold these men accountable to the standards of today, right? Or this idea that their legacy should be canceled or erased because there were aspects of their life that were racist and that were clearly anti-inclusionary, or in Muir's case, quite derogatory towards Native Americans that lived in the parks and that were subsequently kicked out. In Roosevelt's quite colonialist in his approaches to Latin America, but also his views on Native Americans and African Americans. Madison Grant is quite connected to the conservation movement and is also the author of some of the most renowned works of white supremacy to come out of the 1910s and 1920s. So he's someone that his life work was on eugenics movements and cleaning the world for the white race. So he's in a bit of a different category, but John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt, if we dismiss them altogether, we lose too much, right? And it's worthwhile to point out the flaws that they had, but we also can't hold them to the standards of what people have today, right? That's ahistorical, and it's also not useful. What I think is a more interesting enterprise, rather than cancel or erase components that are unsettling today, is to actually add in the pieces that have been erased, right? And to not give necessarily these men more attention by calling them out as racist or by trying to denigrate what their contributions were, but instead add other folks to the conversation, right? And expand it in that way. And so a traditional timeline of conservation has some really important landmarks in it. Yosemite was the first state park that was actually declared by the federal government, but then given to the state of California. So Yosemite would have been the first national park, but California was already a state. And so the federal government decided to turn it over to California. So Yosemite wasn't actually first, even though the conservation momentum started earlier there than it did in Yellowstone. Yellowstone then becomes, by many tellings, but not all, the first national park in the world in 1872. And Yellowstone becomes a national park kind of by default. And it's worth thinking about why that is and how that happens. Yellowstone becomes a national park because it's in Wyoming territory, right? It's not in a state. It's in territory the United States is occupying that continues to be claimed by Native American peoples, right? But that is this territory, not a state with representation in the federal system. And so because it can't be turned over to a state like Yosemite was to California, it thus becomes national, right? So this idea that the US was so forward-thinking and was, sort of contemplating and planning this suite of park jewels is inaccurate, right? It was really sort of public policy expediency that meant that it became a national park and not a state one like existed in other places, in Arkansas and in places around the world. Other British settler colonies created parks almost immediately after, right? Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all created parks quite quickly after Yellowstone, and many of them had been contemplating them contemporaneously. Brazil, actually, a freed slave from Brazil, Rebouças was his last name, came to the United States and heard about Yellowstone and went back to Brazil in 1875 and proposed 3 different parks, 2 of which subsequently became parks in the 20th century. But, right, so this was a big part of British settler society, and that's where it gets formalized in a legal apparatus, but it's an idea that's discussed elsewhere. What do you notice? So if we take, I mentioned the maps before, but if we take the timeline of growth in protected areas, this is data compiled from the protected areas database, but put together by the International Union of the Conservation of Nature on protected areas. What does this timeline tell us about the narrative of conservation or how conservation has happened? It's a pretty clear story based on this, right? Can somebody articulate it for us? Yeah, so so this timeline is quite contemporary, and Leif is saying that it's sort of the march of Western civilization, right? It's very much a progressive narrative, right? The idea started with one park, and then 100 years later, you have hundreds of thousands of acres, right? 25 million acres protected in there. So this sort of march of progress is depicted on here, and it's very much true, right? As I described before in the nature state, almost all nations protect some place as a national park, so that's very much part of it. But a timeline like this doesn't take into account the parks that were degazetted, right, that were taken out of commission, the parks that were converted later into sites for exploration, the parks that have been devolved back to native communities or otherwise kind of reorganized. So it is very much a progressive timeline, and it is incomplete in the ways that it tracks this data. But nevertheless, it does tell us that conservation has become a really important force globally in the past 100 years, right? So there's a couple things that I want to, this isn't a history class and I don't teach US history, but there's a couple things that I think are really important to correct when we talk about public lands. And there's this peculiar bit of amnesia in US history that I've never quite understood. And in part that's because I come at this kind of from the South, as in Latin America. And one of those is Columbus. There's a Columbus Day still celebrated as a federal holiday, right? Columbus has a particular place in the US identity, even though Columbus never touched soil in the US, right? He landed in the Caribbean, and the rest sort of came from there. And then in the US sort of narrative of settlement and history, Jamestown comes next, right? What was Jamestown in 1619? Anybody know what Jamestown represents? We're in Idaho, so we're allowed to forget some of these things. But yeah, it's the first permanent British settlement on the mainland, right? So Columbus, 1492, the British in 1619, poof, 100 years of Spanish occupation gone from US history, right? And that's 100 years of the Spanish in the Southwest, as far north as Idaho, up on the San Juan Islands, down through to the tips of Patagonia, right? And that piece has been erased from US history. Does that mean we need to criminalize the British? No, but it means we need to add something to the way that we tell the history. Another piece that's particularly problematic for me when it comes to telling US history is this idea that there were 13 original colonies, right? And those 13 original colonies were so brave and so fierce and so thoughtful and seceded, right, to create this important union. Well, okay, but there were at least 16 mainland colonies, right? 3 of those, which become later Canada, do not secede. And the richest colonies in the British system were in the Caribbean. Bermuda, Barbados, none of those colonies secede, right? The ones that do are the ones that aren't quite making it, right? So it isn't this, there were only 13. It was only 13 were willing to take that risk, right? And so that larger context, again, is erased. So same with this sort of idea of Spanish heritage in the United States that gets forgotten or left out purposefully, and that is that there is no other foreign language represented more fully in the 50 US states than Spanish, right? There are 4 states that have fully Spanish names, right? And yet, those contributions to the United States are almost erased, right? Colorado, Florida, Montana, and there's one more, I'm forgetting what the other one is, right? That signify words in Spanish. And then this is perhaps the most relevant piece for the kind of reckoning we're having as a society in the United States right now that's echoing around the world. And this is the kind of civil rights movement that several of you have mentioned before as part of our contemporary moment. And this is the piece where slavery is an important and immediate backdrop in the US history. But to only understand slavery from a US perspective is to leave out the core of the story, right? So 12 million Africans are thought to have been brought, right, stolen, that social capital ripped from societies in Africa, sent across the Atlantic, and arrived in the Americas. 12 million people, right? At least 2 million of those died in the passage, and this is over the span of 300 years when slavery existed, right? So the first slaves were brought by Columbus, and the slave trade was outlawed in 1808, officially finally ended in 1850, not fully abolished throughout the Americas until Brazil in 1889 and Cuba the year after, right? But in that span of time, 12 million Africans are brought to the Americas. How many of those 12 million land in the United States? Does anybody want to take a guess? 500,000. Less than half of 1 million come to what's today the United States, right? So if we talk about Black Lives Matter, slavery is shaping the US, and we leave out the 11.5 million that end up in the Caribbean, in Brazil, in Chile, throughout Mexico, and all of Latin America, we're not even scraping the surface of the story of slavery in the Americas, right? And so to think about protected areas from a lens or a critical perspective of the African-American experience is to really have to think about it in terms of Brazilians, in terms of Cubans, in terms of Haitians, and in terms of where Africans and their diaspora ended up in the Americas as well. And the numbers are not controversial, right? They're there all the time, but they're systematically ignored in part because of the importance of slavery within the United States. So why do you think this is? Why are these pieces of our collective past sort of novel? Why does it take a Latin American history professor to introduce these? Why do you think they are forgotten or left out?
Because of who's written about history.
Yeah, Stephanie said because of who's written history. Absolutely, right? Yeah, very much so. Right? And so we're not going to belabor that because there's a lot more I would like to add, and I will bring this back to conservation, I promise. But there's also a lot of power in including people, right? I think there's more power in including people than there is trying to cancel them or kick them out. And the more that we include, the greater depth we have for ourselves and for building a better future, right? So we can think about the roots of conservation from a British perspective. And that is not inaccurate, right? There is a lot to support that. But there are alternative routes of conservation that are worth pointing out. So a particularly interesting one has to do with Argentina, who got its first national park in 1903, depending on how you count it. So Francisco Moreno was the son of a Spanish immigrant and a Spanish immigrant and a British mother. He was born in Buenos Aires, so he was born in Argentina, and he was very much a scientist. So he went out into the plains around Buenos Aires and was a natural historian, so he described the animals that he saw. He was hired by the Argentine government to survey lands in Patagonia, and so he spent 15 years traveling up and down southern Argentina and mapping watercourses and resources. So in some ways, Francisco Moreno was the Lewis and Clark of Argentina, right? He negotiated the boundary line between Argentina and Chile. So if you think about South America, the bottom looks like an ice cream cone, right? And down the spine in the middle is the division between Argentina and Chile. And it's a really important political division because it follows the line on which water falls. All land that has water that flows down to the Atlantic is Argentine. All land that has water that flows off the mountains and into the Pacific is Chilean. And Moreno helped negotiate that treaty. As compensation for his work, the Argentine government gave him 25 leagues. Don't ask me to convert that. I don't actually know how much that is. It's a lot, but I don't know what the acreage is. 25 leagues of property, and those 25 leagues, he gave 5 back to the Argentine government and asked it to be Argentina's first national park, the National Park of the South. And so this was the park where Teddy Roosevelt is standing right here in 1913, right? So this national park is donated by a private citizen, right, back to the government to use as a national park. It's probably the first case of a private entity giving public resources to be used for everyone. And it doesn't immediately become a national park that people can use, right? It takes until the 1920s when Argentina creates a National Park Service and it gets administration and then it gets a fancy lodge and a bunch of other things. But postcards start coming out, right? Like this one with Teddy Roosevelt who visits there in his trip through South America in 1913. And then up at the top, Parque Nacional Nahuel Huapi is this postcard right here. And who is depicted here is a Tehuelche chief, Sayekwe, who had held Moreno captive for 3 weeks when he tried to pass between Argentina and Chile through the Sierra, through the mountains there. So there's a depiction of that park. It's very much in a similar style and quite contemporaneous, right? So that's a piece that is distinct, and you might argue, and some people have, that Argentina is as close to a British settler society as there is in Latin America, right? It's very much a nation of immigrants, like the United States is, and so there's important similarities in terms of size and financial resources and also state capacity, which are all important pieces of that puzzle. Another piece, though, is Mexico. And Mexico creates some forest reserves in the mid-19th century and has a couple other pieces of conservation legislation. But Mexico gets its first national park in 1917, which is the same year that the Mexican Revolution creates a new constitution. And this is easily the most radical constitution of the 20th century. It's the first social revolution of the 20th century. So this is a revolution where 1/6 of all Mexicans died, right? So equivalent in loss to the US Civil War, but more purposeful in direction in the way it sought to incorporate working people and peasants into the governance of the country. So the Mexican Revolution was very much a retaliation for foreign occupation, both British and American, also a little bit of French, of Mexican resources, and it is a proposal for creating a new, more egalitarian society. And so the 1917 Constitution puts a lot of this into place. And historians have talked a lot about how that resulted in labor laws. It resulted in a new education system that sent rural teachers out into the countryside to teach people to read for the first time ever. It had gender policies. It reworked natural resources. So this is when Mexican oil becomes property of the state. If you've ever been to Mexico, well, if you'd been to Mexico before 2006, you would have seen only one kind of oil, Pemex. Right, a green and red and white company, and that's the only place that you could buy oil. That was a state-owned oil. So they reclaimed all of that land. Well, part of this process of remaking society was actually creating national parks. And when Lázaro Cárdenas, who was president from 1934 to 1940, became president, he created a department for national parks within the Bureau of Forestry. And he also put into place a set of reforms that created, and this is my favorite image of it, a mosaic of land tenure in the countryside, right? So this includes irrigation districts that are seen in red, ejidos, which is a reconstitution of an Aztec form of communal property owning. And it was a way of deciding what happens among the people that worked it. So it wasn't private property, but it also wasn't state-owned property, right? It was something in between, in the middle. This community-owned ejido was a major force of land reform from the revolution. There were also forest reserves, and up by the peasant who's looking at this amazing map, right? Up by his left hand is a national park. Right? And so it's part of this mosaic of land use that comes out of Mexico in the 1930s and propels Mexico to the forefront of conservation and really has a unique form of thinking about what this means and who it includes. So one other way we can see this is to think about the inverse geography of how these parks get distributed. In Mexico, they're nearly all concentrated in the core of the country. So if you've been to Mexico, you know that the center is where Mexico City is, right? 20 million people living all within this singular valley with volcanoes around the sides and some of the highest peaks in North America. The inset map gives you a depiction. DFA is the federal district or Mexico City. And all the little dots are the parks around it. So what do you notice that's different about this way of placing parks from what we've talked about in the US system? Anybody on Zoom? The parks are placed around population centers. Why? So people can use them, right? They're not in North Dakota. They're not in Idaho, where there's very few people. They are placed where the workers, the peasants, the people can use the parks, right? Fundamentally different, very democratic form of conservation, right? Does that result in species conservation or the protection of natural resources or conserving water or any of those? That's a different question, right? And it's mostly no, right? But they are parks very much for people with a social piece in mind. Any questions? Have I put everybody on Zoom asleep by now? No, okay. Then I will keep talking. So there's another piece of this erasures, right? So it's easy to say, well, yeah, but those are different countries, right? They have a different heritage, they have different systems, they have a different culture and a different sort of approach to land management. So of course, it's distinct. Yes, that's true, although it is part of the larger context, but there are pieces where it seems that Latino, Latina, Latinx contributions to the conservation movement have been left out, right? So you have seen, and I shared for the reading today, several of these, many people that have become more critical of some of the founders of conservation. Madison Grant, of course, but Roosevelt and Muir has now, about a month and a half ago, the Sierra Club, which Muir founded, denounced Muir as a racist, right? They said that, you know, he has this piece of his past, and it was a really important political strategic move for the Sierra Club. But it was also, I think, a way of reckoning with some of that heritage. You're starting to see some inclusion of this man, Aldo Leopold. How many of you have read something by Aldo Leopold? Okay, good. Mostly in Mari's class. Did you read it for 300? Yes. Other places? Okay. So who is Leopold? Give me a synopsis, some of you that have read him, of some of what his contributions are or have been. What does he contribute to how we understand conservation in the US? So this is why it's so interesting and so problematic. He's so much more interesting than how he's taught. That most of you have read him but don't remember any of it. It's sort of interesting, right? And sort of problematic. But Aldo Leopold was trained as a forester at Yale, and then he gets a job as a game warden and goes and works in southern New Mexico. And while he's working in New Mexico, he has a series of epiphanies. The most famous and the most important is that predators are important. Right? And he starts to see that when you take predators out of the system, you have an explosion of game animals, right? Like deer. And then they destroy their own habitat because there's no one keeping their population in check, right? And so he has this epiphany as he shoots a wolf in southern New Mexico that that's the wrong thing to do. And so his own thinking becomes the profile for how largely game management has changed in the United States and an approach to predators. So that's sort of the pivot point for wolves, but also for other predators in terms of game management on federal lands. While he's in New Mexico, he marries a New Mexican woman, Estella Leopold, or Estella, what's her last name? Vergara, I think, who is a fourth generation Spanish resident of New Mexico, right? She's not Mexican, but her family came from Spain to Santa Fe before it was the United States, right? So she herself is very tied to that Spanish culture. She sings all of the kids lullabies in Spanish, right? 2 of their 4 children, all of whom go on to be gifted scientists, are given Spanish names, Estella and Luna. And his contributions are shaped in part by the time he spent with his son hunting in Mexico. So he hunts grizzly bears in the Chihuahuan ranges, he hunts deer on the border, he spends a lot of time going across the border in between New Mexico and Chihuahua and Sonora as well. And yet, his story is not told with those contributions of Spanish, right, of living in the Southwest, or of participating in conversations with Mexicans in Spanish about that. So Leopold is largely portrayed as a white Wisconsin farmer, right, who learns about game management at Yale. That's not incorrect, but that leaves out half of his life, right? That leaves out his wife, that leaves out his children, that leaves out his time in Mexico and New Mexico, and how that influenced him, right? So it is purposefully erased. So rather than saying he's a Wisconsin racist, it might be more accurate to say he was highly influenced by Mexican and Spanish approaches to the environment, right? And that would broaden the way we think about public policy and whatnot. Another important figure is George Wright. His actual name is George Melendez Wright because his mother was from El Salvador. She was part of one of the richest families in El Salvador, one of the 14 families they were called. It owned nearly all of the property and resources. And she married a British man and moved to San Francisco. And that's where George grew up, although he always spoke Spanish and did spend a good bit of his childhood in El Salvador. George Wright and the George Wright Society is the biggest conservation nonprofit supporting national parks, right? And because he came from a wealthy background, he spent his own money at the service of the Park Service. He did the first survey of wildlife in the United States, and he was instrumental in working on the border towards Big Bend National Park and towards binational conservation between Mexico and the United States. He's a tremendous scientist and scholar, and yet he is, because his name, his anglicized name becomes George Wright, that he is contributing from Latin America is nearly always erased from that, and this is a picture of him. So, okay. All right, so there are two other points that I want to make, and then there's a couple other slides on here, but they are largely sort of supportive of this general argument that we get more by adding in what's been erased than by sort of pushing people out of the conversation. And one of these is the piece of the US Homestead Act, and I'm not sure if it'll come up next week or with Dr. Langston's presentation, but the US Homestead Act is the most fundamental piece of legislation, not just for public lands, but for the world we know it in the United States right now, right? And for the way that property has been distributed and the way that it has accumulated. There is no other law quite like the US Homestead Act in the Americas. And in fact, the Mexican Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, revolutions in Chile and other places were largely fought for something like the Homestead Act. Right? And the Homestead Act has not been given, I think, its proper due in US history. So this could also go on that slide of like things that were left out and that should get more attention. The Homestead Act is the single piece of legislation. And it's important to know that it was passed when all the Southern slave owners had seceded, right? So it never would have been ratified as a radical redistribution of property if the South hadn't already seceded. Right? And so it passes without that opposition, which is really important for understanding race and slavery, but also really important for understanding the democratizing power of property. So the two pieces of the Homestead Act that are transformational are the way that it distributes land to people that want it. It is not particularly gender specific or racially specific. It's 1864, right? Or 1862. So it is not intentionally inclusive, but it's also not exclusive in that way. So in giving property and encouraging settlers to go west, it transforms the occupation of that land. That has tremendous impacts on individual families, but it also has devastating impact on Native American rights and property that is redistributed without their permission, right? So it becomes the fundamental piece of legislation that leads to the colonization, that leads to the Indian Wars, that leads to frontier occupation that national parks result from, right? And so those things have to be seen together, and that it happens so early and doesn't happen in the rest of Latin America is truly exceptional. Okay, and then the last one, and then I will let you all go, is that there are exceptions within Latin America where certain types of land reform have transformed people's livelihoods. And one of these is that the rubber tappers in Brazil have been given credit for being traditionally extractive industries. So they tap the rubber from a tree by cutting a slice in it and then traveling to maybe 50 trees in a day and taking that latex and turning it into latex products, right? And this was given a certain conservation status. It's not native rights. It's not, urbanites that are going out there for recreation. It's a form of land use that's sustainable and that is not transforming the way the forest functions, right? So those pieces in the middle are also an important part of the kind of patrimony of conservation. Okay, I have talked way too long. I have not given you enough chance for questions, which are unfortunately difficult to take in these dual formats. But I would like you to look through the slides. We will prepare for Dr. Nessifer's talk and Leif's introduction on Wednesday. And then next Friday, we'll meet in here again and we'll explore some of the ways the General Land Office took up the Homestead Act transformation and sort of map the way that that looks. Thank you.